our topic for this webinar is Building an Organizational Archive for Digital Materials, featuring Sam Meister. Today is November 5th, 2025, and I've just got a couple intro slides to get us through. So some of you may or may not know about Arts Midwest. We're a U.S. regional arts organization that supports, informs, and celebrates arts organizations and creative communities. And we serve Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, North Dakota, Ohio, South Dakota, Wisconsin, and the 42 federally recognized Native nations that share this geography. So that map gives a nice picture of what our area is that we generally serve. But we're so excited to have folks from all over the place with us today. Also, we must start out with just a little bit of housekeeping. Today's session is being recorded, and we'll share the link afterwards via email. You'll get a message 2 days after the event. If anybody today needs any closed captioning, know that the CC button is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and it enables live captions. If you have any questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A box at any time. My colleague Holly will be monitoring that Q&A and uplifting questions after our presentation today. And then we will continue to work on the chat and making sure we can enable the everyone feature. And also, last but not least, we really want to give a warm thank you to the Hearst Foundation that has made all of these webinars possible. We're so pleased to be able to present this material today. So without any further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Sam Meister is an archivist and educator based in Skokie, Illinois, who has been working in and within libraries, archives, museums, galleries, artists, and nonprofit organizations for over 15 years. So without any further ado, Sam, I'm going to stop sharing and feel free to throw your slides up.
I'm going to talk for a minute before throwing my slides up. So yeah, thanks, Ellen. Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here today presenting this webinar as part of the larger Arts Midwest series on navigating risk and change. We're in a moment of lots of change, and I'll be talking about change as a big part of doing this work. So I appreciate being able to participate in that theme. So as Ellen mentioned, I've been doing this work for over 15, going on 20 years now. And one of the primary reasons that I started my consulting practice was to engage and work directly with arts organizations and artists to develop strategies that make sense for them to take care of their valuable digital materials. So my roots are working in and with cultural heritage institutions, right, who typically have some kind of mission, right, to preserve their collections. But what I've really focused on is developing approaches that make sense for individuals and organizations that are really more focused on creation and production, right, sort of doing the work in support of their mission or their purpose. Because we're all producing materials, right, that are valuable and worth keeping and deserve the opportunity to take a proactive and intentional approach to keeping those materials around. So my goal today is to provide a framework for getting started doing that work. And I hope that you come away feeling empowered to start taking some simple, practical steps to ensure future access to your digital materials. And so the plan is I'll talk a bit about sort of the why, right? Why it's useful and valuable to start doing this work, and then pretty quickly jump into the how and give you some again, simple steps for starting. And along the way, there'll be a couple reflection moments where I have a couple prompts where, yeah, I've just, encourage you to sort of think about something that I've just said and reflect on it and potentially share your ideas or thoughts in the chat. I know the chat is in the works in terms of everyone seeing, but right now at least I can see what folks are saying, and that's helpful that I can sort of you sort of build that in going forward. So yeah, I'll talk a couple moments for you to share some things, and then we'll have the Q&A at the end. So now I will share my screen. Okay. So let's start off with a definition of archive or archives. And these words have a range of meanings, interpretations, or uses. To keep things simple, we're going to use this definition. An archive is a collection of materials that have value. You won't necessarily find that definition on the Society of American Archivists glossary, but I think it's helpful for our context. And a collection is a group of items, right, that are related in some way. And materials include both physical things and digital things. If something has value, then it's worth keeping and caring for. Archives are often associated with things that are from the past, but we are all, right, creating the archives of the future on a daily basis. In our current moment, we're producing lots of digital materials, data, digital assets all the time. So that's why our focus here is on planning for, building, and maintaining a digital archive for an arts organization or an artist's creative practice. Compared to your regular activities of making, exhibiting, and selling your artwork, or planning and carrying out your organization's programs, it may seem like dedicating time and effort to building an archives is a low priority. You have much more potentially important things to do. But the benefits, right, of archiving work, of doing this work, can directly and positively impact those things that you are doing on a daily basis. When digital assets are systematically organized and described, they're easier to search, to find, to use, and that really increases your ability to be more efficient in your work, whatever that work may be. Making deliberate decisions about what to keep, right, what's important, and what can be deleted decreases the amount you need to pay for things like digital storage. Keeping records of programming and services allows you to analyze and demonstrate how your organization has changed over time and plan for future growth. When key people move on, an archive can serve to capture the knowledge needed to educate and train new leadership and staff. And when disruptions occur, whatever that may be, when you have an archive of the most important records and data, that can ensure that you can get back up to speed faster, right, in your regular programming and operations. From an artist perspective, right, quick access to documentation of your work will make it easier to share with curators, galleries, and collectors. And with a comprehensive archive, you can really actively shape the narrative of your creative practice. So those are some of the benefits. There are some risks, right? Sort of the scenario where if we don't do anything, there's the potential that things can be lost in various kinds of ways. So we're constantly creating and interacting with digital materials of all kinds, right? Text, audio, video, images, websites, software, and it can seem, right, as if this content is going to be around forever. But anyone who has lost data, right, because their computer crashed or their account in a web-based service was discontinued for some reason, we all know that digital information is fragile and ephemeral. It's here today, but it can easily be gone tomorrow. So to ensure continued access to the valuable information in those digital assets, we need to be able to keep the digital bits and some amount of metadata about those assets available. But there are a variety of risks that can make it challenging to do this work. So understanding these risks, knowing how to prepare for them, can help limit their impact and potential loss. There's the issue of media obsolescence, right? Technology like hard drives, flash drives, computers, smartphones, right? They get old and are replaced with newer versions, which can make it hard to get data off of these older devices if we don't do it fairly quickly. Media infrastructure also just fails, right? Hard drives only usually work reliably for about 5 years, then they're likely to crash or become corrupted, which can be a risk, and you can potentially lose any and all of the data stored on them. File formats become obsolete. If you're saving files in proprietary formats that are dependent on specific software, it may be difficult to access those files in the future. There's also harmful access, right? Any data that's stored in a networked or online account is at risk of being captured, right, or held ransom by malicious actors. Sometimes we just accidentally delete files, right? We're not sure what was in that folder, but we decided to get rid of it, and now some important stuff is gone. And then, of course, there's sort of larger scale, right? There's natural and human-caused disasters. Everything from, right, pipes bursting or fires starting in an attic to floods and hurricanes and wildfires, right, that can destroy the infrastructure where our data is stored. This is not necessarily a comprehensive list of all the kinds of risks, but some big ones to consider and think about and be prepared for. So here's our first reflection. I'm just curious, right? And usually this is the case that people have lost some data. But yeah, if you have lost data, what'd you lose? What was the impact? Do you know, can you sort of pinpoint the cause? Yeah, just even if you don't want to share in the chat, yeah, just sort of mull that over. And I feel like this can be an important grounding to what we were talking about, right? To really connect it to a personal experience. And often that can help, I guess, propel us to be a little more proactive in preparing and trying to limit those kinds of losses in the future. Hard drives crashing. Uh, I saw somebody said apartment fire. Yeah, there's various kinds. Yep. Dropped a hard drive on the floor. Sometimes, yeah, the people that know how to use things aren't available anymore. Okay, so again, this is a familiar concept in terms of digital information being ephemeral. So yeah, just sort of keeping that worst case scenario in mind, we'll move forward. So first steps, right? The sort of little steps that you can start taking towards building something sustainable. A big one, building and maintaining an archive will necessitate a shift, right? A change in your thinking and actions. Most of us are doing work in our organizations or our creative practices it's focused on short-term objectives, creating artworks for an exhibition or organizing a fundraising event. We're in production mode and produce what is needed and then move on to the next project or program. To build a sustainable archive, you need to embrace an archival mode as well. And that really entails a shift in thinking, in part by extending the timeline for how you sort of define and imagine the use of your valuable materials from the short term, right, sort of meeting the goal, the initial goal, to longer term, right, sort of the longer term kind of goals or other kinds of uses that you define. It also includes a change in practice, right? By integrating some of the archival actions that we'll talk about into your regular production activities, taking some simple steps to prepare your digital materials for continued access beyond the immediate need, whatever that may be. So that shift in thinking, or less sort of incorporation of another mode of thinking. And as with any new project, any sort of new initiative or endeavor, it's useful to start by imagining and briefly documenting a vision for the future that you're trying to achieve with your archive. And this will be helpful, again, whether the context is an individual artist or a group of people in an arts organization. By describing and defining a vision of the future when your archive is operational, right? It's up and running smoothly. Everything is where it needs to be. It enables you to do lots of different things, maybe in a more efficient ways. That will help to clarify your particular local context and the motivations for creating the archive, and provide the grounding for the regular tasks, right, that will be needed to maintain that archive over time. So again, as with any kind of vision, right, you can sort of point to it and say, this is why we're doing what we're doing. This is where we're trying to get to. A good next step is to better understand the current status of the digital materials that you already have. And a simple way to do this is to document some basic information about your digital assets in something like an inventory, right? A list, right? That includes things potentially like the data size, right? Your content types, video, audio, text, images, what file formats you have, PDFs, WAV, JPEGs, weird file formats, you're not sure what they are, and storage locations, right? So where are your assets? Are they on an external hard drive, in somewhere like Google Drive or iCloud? Documenting those things can be helpful. And the goal here isn't to get all the details about every individual file. That's too time intensive, but rather create some high level categories and summary information for your digital assets. And we have a template here. The slides will be available later, also in the articles that we'll link to at the end, also for a template for creating an inventory. So those are first steps, but I will shift now into sort of the strategy and planning, and then how to sort of put that into practice. So starting an archive, right, for your organization or practice, it can feel like a lot, right? It can be easy to feel overwhelmed, right, and not end up doing anything. And so that's where an archive strategy, can play such an important role. Your strategy or your plan, it functions as a set of intentions and instructions to guide you in building and maintaining your archive. It's a place where you can document initial decisions about the structure and the process for your archive. And then it serves as a resource that you can refer back to, right, when you're carrying out those ongoing archival tasks. In the same way, it can be used as a guide to train other people who are maybe coming into your organization or your practice in doing some or all of those archival tasks. And again, we've put together a template to help you get started in creating your own version of an archive strategy. We'll start with the big one, what I think is the big one. So keeping everything you produce, it isn't necessarily feasible or sustainable. When you need to search and find digital assets later on, it can be so much more difficult if you have a huge volume of files to wade through. And while digital storage, right, is relatively inexpensive, it's more cost effective to only store the materials you actually need to keep. And so this is why selection, right, or deciding what specific digital materials are actually valuable and worth keeping is a key component of an archive strategy. It's really the place to start. So developing a selection framework where you define and assign levels of value to your digital assets will be helpful in determining what assets need to be kept for different periods of time and which assets or materials can be deleted. This step is key to ensuring you're consistently identifying and selecting materials for long-term care and access, as well as, right, being efficient and effective with resources that'll be needed to ensure that continued access. And if you've done something, right, like this inventory for your digital materials, you can use that as a starting point for developing a selection framework. This is not necessarily complicated, right? I'm trying to keep things pretty simple. So it's helpful to just start by coming up with a small set, 5 to 8 initial categories or groups for the digital materials you're regularly producing. These categories could be based on your work activities and outputs or some other system that makes sense to you. And then you assign values, right? You decide what's important. But I recognize that that's highly subjective, right? Like sort of depends on your situation. And the aim of creating a set of values, again, is to provide a framework that can help with the routine tasks of organizing and categorizing materials that you're producing on a regular basis. And so the language or the labeling of the value levels you create, those should be meaningful and useful to you, but also reasonably easy to understand by others. Okay, we've come to our second reflection moment. So yeah, think about what you're creating or producing regularly. Maybe that's something you're working on today before this webinar happened. Maybe something you've been working on this week, something this month, or just, what kind of work you're regularly doing. Of what you're producing, what is actually highly valuable, right? What are you sort of needing to come back to? What has value in different ways for you? And why is that, right? And maybe it's just sort of one example. Think of sort of one thing that you can sort of point to very quickly and say, yes, these images are valuable for these reasons, or these kinds of documents, or this data. Yeah, if people want to share something in the chat, that would be awesome. Because again, this is the kind of exercise in thinking about developing your own local selection framework that you would be doing, right? You'd sort of take the time to ponder and really reflect and evaluate and think about what is valuable, what are different value levels you could come up with. Is that based on how you're using things, how often you need to find them, uh, how long you might need to keep something. It's valuable for a certain amount of time, but then after that, it sort of diminishes in value. So different lenses you could potentially use. I see folks are sharing some good stuff here. Oral histories and photographs. Yep, submitting art for shows, financial records, process documents. Yeah, these all are great. Totally makes sense. And so once you've created, right, categories and values, you can sort of finalize or finalize an initial version of your selection framework. And each category will likely have a different set of values of what is important to the archive. And so you can put that together in something like a rubric or whatever makes sense to you. What I have here is just sort of an example, right, of what that might look like, where you have categories of records or assets. If you're an organization, something like fundraising or administration, you might have examples, right, of those types of materials, something like membership campaign data. And the value level, again, here is based on sort of time, right? It's sort of saying that these are valuable in the near term, right? So maybe that's 3 to 5 years. You could be specific about that, or even shorter. And you can mark, right, that these are worth keeping permanently, or they only need to be kept for a certain amount of time. And that gives you, again, a guide that can inform what needs to happen in terms of selecting or removing different kinds of assets going forward. So beyond that selection framework, we're moving into the zone of describing and organizing assets now. But that action, right, of developing a set of categories for your assets is really an initial step in describing, organizing, and preparing those assets for storage and future access. Some next steps include putting those categories into practice, right, through something like a file naming system and a folder structure, and coming up with a minimal set of metadata or descriptive terms that make sense for your particular context and workflows. And over time, this initial approach to description can shift and be expanded as needed, right? You can start with something simple and grow over time. But on the real side, organizing and describing your materials is likely to be the most time-consuming part of managing your digital materials. But these activities function as the bridge, right, between the moment you create those materials and when you need to access them in the future. Investing time and energy in the organization and description, it's a necessary step to make it easier to search, find, and browse your materials going forward, right? To, as much as possible, not have the situation of a bunch of things just sitting on your desktop, right? That you have no idea what they are, or you don't even see them, right? That's the higher risk, that you have so much that's so messy that the loss is not necessarily that it's disappeared because of a hard drive crash, but that you can't find it, like even if you want to, because it's so unclear where and why things are being kept in certain ways. So naming files as you create them based on an established system will make it easier, again, to search and find those later. Think of the file name as the title for the file, something that provides a simple description, but not all the potential details, right? Can't jam it all in the file name. And again, this is where you could consider using the asset categories that you developed as starting points for a file name structure. It will be easier to be consistent with file naming if you do it as you are creating new files, right? In the process of starting a new document or naming a bunch of images rather than waiting until later. And what I have here, again, is just an example, right, of sort of short form of how you might name, right, something like an annual report document. Next step, saving files in preservation-friendly formats, again, in sort of right away or in the moment of creating, it provides flexibility to create different types of access versions of those files in the future. So stepping back, a file format defines how information is encoded in a digital file and provides instructions for how information can be rendered and displayed by software applications, right? So that way, a PDF, when you try and open it in Adobe Acrobat, it knows what a PDF is and it knows how to open it and display the contents of those files. When we select file formats that are that are open, well documented, and based on community standards, that is going to better support preservation and future access, as opposed to sort of closed or commercial or highly proprietary formats that are dependent on only one piece of software that can function as a barrier in and of itself to access those files in the future if perhaps that software isn't supported anymore or isn't available. So when you save or output your working files in a range of preservation file formats, that will depend sort of when you do it, that'll depend on your local workflows, right? Sort of when you're in the process of finalizing or finishing, right, a particular kind of asset, right? If there's a certain amount of editing or refining that happens, then it's likely that it's going to be however you characterize what the final version is. And I know that that can be a blurry boundary in some situations. When there's a clear and logical place where digital assets should be kept, it's much easier to do the work of organizing along the way as you are creating, receiving, editing, and finalizing those materials. And this kind of approach makes it much less likely that you, again, end up with a messy assortment of files on your desktop or in random folders. You're not really sure why they exist. And even if you are primarily working within web-based services like Google Workspace, Microsoft 365, Dropbox, whatever you might be using, you can still use, right, a sort of folder template structure to organize your assets. And again, this is where the categories you develop could be an excellent starting point for a folder structure, which is what I've tried to sort of illustrate here, right? Sort of these high-level categories that could either have types of assets in them or even subfolders, right, for those particular types of materials. The next level is adding descriptive information. So when you're creating detailed description or metadata, right, for all your individual digital assets, it's not going to be feasible or possible, right? You won't necessarily be able to do it for everything that you create. But there might be a category of those assets, right? Images, video files, where adding more descriptive information beyond the file name is really beneficial, right? And sort of worth the time and effort. Coming up with a simple set of tags or keywords and assigning those to digital assets, it further enhances, right, the ability to sort, group, search, and find those materials quickly. And this kind of descriptive information, right, can be created and maintained in simple and free tools like spreadsheets. Totally reasonable to use spreadsheets. But databases will provide more advanced functionality and a better user experience. And there are a range, right, of web-based services that provide easy entry points for creating databases, including a handful geared towards artists, right? Even something like Airtable, right, can be a great, easy place, relatively easy place for creating your own database. And there is a growing marketplace, right, of digital asset management systems that are worth considering, but these tend to be more expensive, right? Just the starting point tends to be much higher costs and would really make more sense for larger groups or organizations, right? Where you're sort of investing in infrastructure that's going to support a wide variety of people. Once you have prepared, described, and organized your digital materials, the final step, regular repeated step, is putting them in a safe and secure storage location. Keeping multiple copies in multiple locations is a simple and robust archive storage strategy for preventing complete loss of your valuable digital assets. All those risks, right, that I pointed out earlier in terms of the potential kinds of loss that can occur, This strategy of keeping multiple copies in multiple locations can help to mitigate most of those scenarios where if loss occurs in one copy, you have another copy that you can restore from, um, and therefore mitigate, catastrophic loss. The intention of this kind of storage, right, is to be the place to put copies that are only accessed if there is some kind of disaster or loss with locally stored copies, right? That you're putting it there. It's the archive version, the preservation version. You're not touching it on a regular basis. And there's this thing called the 3-2-1 rule you may have heard of that provides a helpful way to remember the kinds of requirements for this storage strategy, where you create 3 copies of your valued digital materials. You store them on 2 different types of storage media where possible. And you ensure that at least one of those copies is stored somewhere else, right? In a different geographic location, right? Not on your only computer in your apartment, your house. You have something somewhere else, preferably as far away as possible, but it depends. And these aren't strict rules, and it may not always be possible to implement each of these fully at first, but they are useful goals to aim for. And a simple example, right, of this kind of strategy, which I've tried to illustrate here, includes, keeping one copy on your laptop or computer, keeping another copy on an external hard drive or something like a network attached storage device that may have multiple hard drives together, and a third copy in a cloud-based storage service, right, to achieve that geographic distribution. There are other ways of implementing this kind of approach. This is just sort of one example of what that might look like. If you think that you're gonna get around to archiving your work later, right? I'll do that at some later point. It most likely means that it won't get done, right? It'll be easy to find other activities that seem more important, right? The sort of the short-term objectives, right? The things that are coming up next, that those are more important. And so this is why I really focus on integrating or weaving your archive strategy, your practice into your regular activities, why that's so important. When those tasks, those archival tasks, start to be seen as not as extra, right, or sort of would be nice, but instead as normal and sort of a core part of what you do, then it's much more likely that you will just continue to do them, right? It'll just be part of what you do. Some of these activities like file naming and organizing into folder structures, those are best, right, sort of carried out continuously, right, as you're creating those assets. But other tasks, they might make more sense to schedule to happen at designated moments. In some contexts, the completion of a project or a program, that might be a good time, right, to do the work of selecting and moving the final versions, right, as you've defined them, to your archive storage locations. In other scenarios, it might make sense to schedule these kinds of tasks or activities, like maybe the more intense work of adding detailed description to images, to happen on some kind of time schedule that makes sense to you. Maybe that's seasonally, quarterly, annually. If there are times, right, during the year, however you define the year, that tend to be more busy with regular work activities, maybe there's a lot of events happening, then maybe it's good to try and find those stretches that are relatively less intense, right? There's a little more downtime to do this particular kind of work. And it may take a few attempts, right, to find that particular time period that fits within your work cycles, and that's okay, right? It's not necessarily going to be perfect at first. You may start something and realize it's not a good fit, but marking that and learning from that and shifting to another time that is more feasible. Creating and maintaining an archive that works for you, it's not going to happen immediately, right? It'll take some time and energy, again, to shift your thinking and practices. And some of that shift in thinking comes through practice, through doing, to get to the point where these kinds of archival activities, they just feel like a regular part of the work that you're doing. It might take years. And it's okay, right, if it's not perfect at first. You're building something intended to grow far into the future, right? And it's helpful to just start with something that feels doable. Perhaps that's just creating and consistently using a local file naming structure or a folder structure that makes sense. Either of just those two elements will help incrementally build an archive where the valuable digital assets you create are cared for and available into the future. So just encourage people to think about the small thing they could start doing pretty quickly, and start doing that. And again, you can build on that over time. So I have some links and resources. The first three links here are to the articles that this webinar is based on. So please check those out. They have a bit more detail, a little more illustration and examples of things like categories and folder structures and things like that. That's where all the templates are as well. There's also a couple links here that are in those articles as well to guidance around file naming best practices, an overview of file formats and standards. And the final one here, I recognize that most people you're still producing physical things, right, in one way or another. And even if you have a lot of digital assets, you have a lot of physical materials too. And so I really like this resource from this Artist Studio Archives project, which again is sort of a workbook and provides a lot of worksheets to sort of get started in thinking about the entirety of the archive in both its physical and digital forms. So all that said, I'm happy to try and answer questions that may have come up already or that people are going to put into the chat. Shall I stop sharing, Alan? Do you think that's best?
Yeah, I was going to say, if you want to stop sharing, that sounds good. And thanks everybody for your patience as we try to iron out the chat thing. Apologies. But what we're going to do is Holly's monitoring the chat and the Q&A. So she's going to select some questions and she's going to read them aloud just so that accessibly people can hear and read both. And then Sam, you free reign to give it your best shot.
Yeah.
Before you jump in though, I'm just going to address some folks have asked, can you share all the links? Can you? And I just want to reassure folks that 2 days from now, 2 days after the event, you will receive an email that has a link to the recording. It'll have a link to Sam's slides, which have all those links in there. So don't worry, we've got you covered. So, all right. And with that, I'll hand it over to Holly.
Yes, hi, thank you. So Sam, you do have quite a few questions here. We'll try to get through as many as we can.
Okay.
What is a preservation-friendly format for video? We have many in our Dakota language work. And then similarly, someone else asked, is there a preferred format for video?
Video, the most complicated format. Video is tough. Video is tough. And in the link in my slide, it will go to sort of a page that breaks down file formats and standards, and within there is some discussion of video. So you'll notice that in the slide that I had up, I used .mov for video. And yes, that serves as an access kind of version, but can be considered preservation friendly as well. Obviously, not just format, there's other steps you can take to ensure you're creating high resolution video, you're not compressing things. There are lots of details I didn't go into right in this talk, right, in terms of like how do we create video for, long-term preservation purposes. So there are some other formats. One's called MXF, which is more of like a container or a wrapper. So I'll say it kind of depends, right, on your situation and what you're producing and what's it for, and how long you might need to keep it in terms of thinking about other options beyond something like .mov. Obviously, there's something called .avi, which is more Windows friendly, so a couple different versions there to consider. But I'm going to stop because I could really go down the rabbit hole with video.
Okay, someone else said, can you please talk about the question of physical files? Is it worth scanning in? In my experience, nobody ever knows how or where to find them in the future.
Yes. When you scan, you're creating digital objects that you then have to take care of, right? So it's a question, just like the question of selecting what of your existing digital assets are actually valuable, right, and are worth keeping. It's a similar kind of question to pose when you're thinking about digitizing or scanning physical files, right? So are these valuable? Is it worth the time and effort to create them? And then with the digital objects, do you have the time and resources to then take care of those resulting outputs from the scanning? So it sort of depends. If you like have narrowed down a subset of documents and access is really important, you need more people to have access to them more quickly, then digitizing can be a means, right, to increase access. That's a big motivator to digitize. So I can't give you a blanket statement, but it really is. It does sort of require that similar kind of lens, right, to make that kind of decision. Because one way or another, you're going to be spending time and energy on it, and you need to think about how is the resulting set of assets, how is that going to provide benefit or improve things going forward.
Thank you. Someone asked, what are the pros and cons of many people participating in archiving versus one or two folks?
Ah, that's a great question. Often it's not the case. We have many people, but I will say that often when I work with organizations, I start from the idea of a decentralized approach, right? So this whole idea of integrating and weaving these actions into regular creation and production, from that perspective, I do think that in any kind of organization, there is some amount of a role and responsibility for everybody to do something related to the sort of future preservation and access of the digital assets that they're creating. So it could be something as simple as just like using the file names, right, according to the structure that we've established, whereas other people might be more involved in creating description or maybe making decisions about storage or maybe even evaluating and selecting. So I'd say in a given setting, it can make sense for lots of people to be doing different parts to support the overall sort of mission or purpose or goal of creating and maintaining the archive over time.
Thank you. How do you feel about the majority of photos or videos being saved in Dropbox?
Oh, I get to come in on Dropbox. Okay. Dropbox is not a place you want to keep things over the long term. Dropbox can work really well as a place for, I would say, temporarily storing your materials. So whether you're doing that to share or collaborate, right? You sort of need something for a project, right? And you need multiple people to have access to those assets during the scope of a project. But there's just limitation when it comes to describing those objects, right? So what's in there. There's some functionality that I talked about in terms of folder organization. And I know that I mentioned that, right, as like a place you should set up your folders. But when you're at the point where you have sort of the final versions and you know you're not necessarily going to need to touch those anymore, they really should be moved somewhere else, somewhere more safe and secure, somewhere that's not synced and might accidentally get overwritten by new objects in some way. So it serves its purpose in terms of maybe short-term or near-term storage, but I would definitely recommend looking at other kinds of options for that sort of archive storage component. And, we could talk about more of those kinds of things if people are curious.
Well, I think someone is curious.
Yeah.
In chat, I see what are some good long-term options. Consider limited funds too.
Sure. Yes. There's options, right? So using something like Google Storage, right, where maybe you have a dedicated place, right, where you've decided that here is the location where I'm going to put these assets, and I'm not touching them on a regular basis. I'm going to limit who has access to that particular account. Something like that could be viable. Even though, again, it's not necessarily designed for something like that. If you're an organization, the Internet Archive has, in the past couple years, launched a storage service. So in addition to whatever you're sort of uploading to the sort of public access side of the Internet Archive, there's also a place where you can pay for, I think, reasonably costed, a reasonable amount. Storage for your assets that again, they're just for you. You have your account, only you get to access them. Of course, there's Amazon Web Services, right, where consumers can purchase storage. Then you're joining the Amazon infrastructure, and that's its own decision-making process, again, whether you're an individual or an organization. But I will say that they have improved what that experience is like for getting storage, for getting data in and out of their systems. There's a variety of other kinds of consumer backups kind of storage systems like Backblaze. So there's a handful of options, but inevitably, yes, you're going to have to pay something to store your assets. And again, that's where selection becomes so important, so that you're really clear about what you're storing, and you understand why you're doing that, and you know the amount that you're investing in and how it's supporting, again, your regular activities. You're not putting things in there that you don't actually need to be paying for. And yes, I will see in the chat, AWS crashed recently. Exactly, right? So there's outages that even come from these huge infrastructure providers. So those are always something to consider in terms of only having a copy in just one system like that.
Well, thank you, Sam. I'm going to move us into another question here. Someone asked, can you give some guidance on file naming, file pathways, and ease of search, i.e. does a dash versus a period versus a space, etc. matter? Sometimes using Mac, when I type words into Finder, it doesn't always kick back the search results in a way that makes sense.
Yes. So again, the link in the slides and in the articles direct out to some file naming best practices, and I sort of expand on that in the articles. But yeah, there are certain kind of characters that can make files names difficult for the systems themselves to understand. So blank spaces are usually bad. Periods can be challenging. Dashes are usually okay. I like to use dashes. I will say that I use dashes quite a bit, and underscores, but mostly dashes these days in terms of dividing between there. So if you're going to pick one, I would go for that. And issues with file managers and search, again, whether you're on a Mac or a Windows, it can be hard. There are inherent limitations to those search capabilities. So as much as you can, again, create the organization structures that you can sort of easily navigate and find things, that can be beneficial, because no matter what, if you're just using the sort of baked in tools, you can only do so much. Again, that's where databases or other systems where you can enrich your files with other kinds of descriptive information, that is what is going to improve search functionality and access beyond anything that what you can find just on your computer.
Okay, someone's asking, what do you suggest for backing up an entire website?
Aha. So there's a handful of tools. One, let me just confirm. I believe it's called Conifer. It's a web archiving service that pretty much individuals can use to basically record their website. And I think they have accounts that you can pay for where they provide I just put it in the chat there, where they provide storage, or you can get sort of a download, right, that then you can put in another storage location. So that's when I would point you right away. Again, the Internet Archive archives the web on a regular basis, and they have a service that's more designed for organizations. So if you're in an organizational setting, that might be something. It's like a subscription kind of service. So that could be worth looking. That's called Archive It. Let me see if I can get that up real quick. I was just looking at it earlier today. Oh no, we're having some dead air here. Okay, there we go. So yeah, hopefully those are a couple good starting points.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. And then we may just have to have you write responses because you're getting a lot of questions here.
I love questions.
What is your favorite strategy for large file sharing without compression? I used to use WeTransfer for audio files, but I'm concerned about their new usage agreement.
Ooh, that's very specific. And let's see. I'm gonna say that I don't have a solid response to that, and just like, yeah, I would say I've used tools like rsync before, but it's been a little while. So yeah, some of the tools, that you use when you're working with something like, cloud storage, they have baked in, right, sort of tools that they use as part of their service, in terms of, again, moving from your location to sort of a backup storage location. But if you're just sort of transferring for collaborating, that you may need different kinds of tools. And so I don't want to list some things that I don't actually have a lot of knowledge or use with. So I'm gonna say someone else might have something more clear to say on that. And maybe if you do, throw it in the chat.
Nice. Thanks, Sam. And before people jet, Holly's going to put a link in the chat for our survey, and we're going to sweeten the pot. Anybody who takes the survey and puts in your email, you get a chance to win a $50 survey prize. So fill out the survey, let us know how we're doing, and we'll look forward to checking out all your feedback. And with that, Sam, thank you so much. This was so helpful and so detailed. And I know I'm looking forward to going into those slides again after this. So thank you so much. Yeah, I love those reactions.
Yeah, my pleasure. Happy to be here. Excited to be
Absolutely.
here.
Yeah, and I should say, folks, make sure you visit the Arts Midwest website if you enjoyed Sam's content. He's also got some published pieces on our website that go into further detail. So we'll make sure that when that email comes out in 2 days, that you have a link not only to the slides, but Sam, I'll also throw in some links to those published pieces as well that go into further detail. So nice. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We appreciate your time and hope you have a beautiful rest of your day. Thank you. All right.
Thanks all. Take care.
Bye.